The year was 1965, and America was consumed by the Vietnam War. You couldn't open a newspaper or turn on the television without hearing about the growing number of Americans fighting in Southeast Asia. And as the death toll increased, so did the protests against the war. In November, anti-Vietnam groups staged a march on Washington, where just 2 years earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. had given his historic I Have a Dream speech. It was a relatively peaceful march. There was no burning of draft cards, no violent protests. Speakers at the rally urged the United States to stop the bombing of North Vietnam and bring our troops home. They also supported Bobby Kennedy's call for an extension of the Christmas truce to allow time for peace negotiations. Among the thousands who attended the march that day was a group of kids from Iowa whose beliefs and actions inspired by this march would lead to a major Supreme Court decision on freedom of speech and students' rights. These children, who would later make history by lending their names to the case, were Christopher Eckert and John Tinker, 15 at the time, and Mary Beth Tinker, who was only 13. On the way home from the march, they discussed what they could do back home in Iowa to express their disagreement with the war. As John put it, our family was surrounded by the anti-Vietnam movement. All of the kids were swept up by it.
And so we would watch on TV the war and scenes from the war. And to us, it just seemed like the world was on fire. You would see smoke coming out of huts and little children running. And there was something called napalm, which is a sticky gel that burns the skin. And it was dropped by the U.S. forces onto the villages. And so you would see soldiers, lying on the ground injured, or the body bags where they would have the soldiers be brought back after they had been killed. And so all of these scenes were very upsetting and emotional to us kids. And so we decided that we should do something about it, to speak up about it and say that we believed in peace. And my older brother John, and even my little sister Hope, and my brother Paul also, decided to wear black armbands. And so
It was decided at a meeting that students would wear black armbands to classes on Thursday, December 16th. They agreed that the armbands served two purposes: to mourn the casualties of the Vietnam War and to support Kennedy's call for an extension of the Christmas truce. A friend of Christopher Eckert wrote an article outlining their plans for the Roosevelt High School newspaper. The school quickly got hold of the article and would not allow it to be published. In spite of the lack of mention of the armbands in the school paper, word spread around the school quickly, and many thought of taking part in the protest. The superintendent of the district and principals of 5 high schools met to discuss the article.
And the principals thought that it would be too disruptive and controversial, and so they made a ruling saying that anyone wearing armbands would be suspended from school.
An announcement was broadcast over the loudspeaker at Roosevelt High School and many other schools, announcing the administrative decision that no black armbands would be permitted at school. Students were upset by the obvious double standard in the district's decision to ban armbands. Many people wore election buttons and even iron crosses at school, and it had never been a problem before. On the morning of the 16th, Christopher wore his armband to Roosevelt High School. He was well aware of the policy against them and went to the administrative office to turn himself in. He was ordered by the vice principal to remove his armband, and Chris would not, stating he believed he had a constitutional right to wear it at school. The vice principal called his mother and informed her that he would be suspended if he did not remove the band. She responded, "I think he has every right to wear it at school, and I will not ask him to take it off." On the same day, young Mary Beth Tinker wore her armband to Harding Junior High. Several other students asked her about it, and she explained. She got the impression that most of them didn't have any strong opinion about the war. It was not until mid-afternoon that her math teacher sent her to the office. She was asked to remove her armband, and she did.
And there's no telling who that it's naming, 'cause the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing.
The next day, John wore his armband to classes at North High School. He received some questions, but he welcomed them because one of the reasons for wearing the armband was to spark concern about the war. Although John was not formally suspended, he was asked not to return to school until he removed the armband.
After we were suspended from school, it really might have been the end of the whole thing, except for luckily there was an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and their whole job since the early 1900s has been to stand up for the Bill of Rights and for the First Amendment and these rights. So they decided to help us with a lawyer, and the lawyer who argued our case was Dan Johnston. He did a fantastic job of taking this case to court.
And don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand for the time.
They decided to appeal his decision. The Southern District of Iowa is part of the Court of Appeals for the 8th District. Johnston, their lawyer, describes his experience in the U.S. Court of Appeals. We went there twice. First, we argued before a 3-judge panel. Then we got a notice that they wanted us back down to argue in front of all 8 judges. That decision split 4-4, so there were no written opinions with any statements of facts or law in them, because the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals wasn't able to reach a decision. The effect of the split decision was to affirm Judge Stevenson's opinion.
It went to the district court first, and then it went to the appeals court, which was divided. And so the fact that they were divided meant that we would have lost the case. And then it was appealed to the Supreme Court. It took several years. And so then we were really happy that the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, because the Supreme Court only accepts, I think, less than 1% of cases that are brought to it. But the court felt that it was a very important case, and that it was important to decide these issues regarding students.
Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School District was argued before the Supreme Court on December 12, 1968, as part of the Warren Court. And given Chief Justice Warren's record with civil liberties cases, he was likely to vote in favor of the Tinkers. In the Supreme Court, the case ultimately came down to whether or not the school had the right to regulate students' free speech. It was noted that the wearing of black armbands is speech, but that speech can be regulated or prohibited only if it possesses a clear and present danger to the school's education. But in this case, no disruption or violence had occurred, and the bands did not in any way interfere with normal classroom activities. The Supreme Court announced their decision 7-2 in favor of the Tinkers. Justice Fortas, who wrote the majority opinion, concluded that symbolic acts of pure speech should not be denied to teachers and students in the public schools. He maintained that it can hardly be argued that students or teachers shed their constitutional right to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. From that day forward, the Tinker case served as a precedent in hundreds of other student rights cases. The Tinker test, as it became known, provided that student expression was to be protected under the First Amendment unless it materially disrupts classwork or involves substantial disorder or invasion of the rights of others. The relevance of the Tinker case can be best described in Mary Beth's own words. "I was scared the day I wore that armband to school, but I knew I had to speak up. The world seemed upside down, but my friends and I had courageous role models to show us how to stand up for what we believed. If you look around, there are many others like that, whether in your home, your school, your neighborhood, your town, or even across the world. You can join them to change the world, and when you do, your life will be meaningful and very interesting."